Deep in the bowels of Belarus, something wicked is stirring. Russia's favorite puppet nation is building up on its borders, and it seems to have only one target in mind: Ukraine. Alexander Lukashenko has finally gone off the deep end. The insanity is real, and what we're seeing now is start of something dangerous and deadly. Prepare for a new war. Putin is pulling more strings, and Lukashenko is the marionette that Russia's leader is using for his new plan. None of this is conjecture. It's all straight from the horse's mouth. In a May 12th report, United 24 media revealed that Belarus's crazy president has been making a lot of noise about how he needs to prepare his country for war. Lukashenko has said that Belarus is going to start selectively mobilizing its military units so that they're all prepared for combat operations. There was no mention of which country would be the subject of these operations, but Lukashenko didn't have to say anything more. Ukraine would be the obvious target. Lukashenko framed his latest plan as a necessity rather than a desire. "We will selectively mobilize units in order to prepare them for war. God willing, it can be avoided," Belarusian leader said. We can read a lot into those words. Is Lukashenko trying to position Ukraine as some sort of aggressor that is trying to force Belarus into an inevitable war? Or is Lukashenko covertly saying that his puppeteer in the Kremlin is putting pressure on him to get involved in the war, and he knows that he will have to jump as soon as Putin tells him to? We can only guess. But what is clear is that Lukashenko's words haven't come out of nowhere. The last few days have seen Belarus seemingly start to make preparations for a fight that Lukashenko believes is coming. Lukashenko made his comments during a meeting with his defense minister Viktor Krenin, and that meeting was held in the wake of military readiness checks that United 24 media says involved 6,000 reservists and military personnel. Those drills were used to assess combat readiness of the troops, as well as the logistical and transportation procedures that Belarus has in place if it ever goes to war. More came out of that meeting with Krenin that offers further insight into where the mad mind of Lukashenko is right now. An unrelenting focus on the modernization of the Belarusian army seemed to be high on Lukashenko's mind. "It's impossible to accomplish defense objectives without equipping our troops with modern weapons. We must have weapons that we can actually use, know how to operate," Lukashenko blared, which seems a little like an admission that Belarus is operating with old weapons that it doesn't understand. Lukashenko also discussed a 5-year plan for his country's military, stating, "It's important that the implementation of the program let us over 5 years to increase the share of modern systems in the armed forces to nearly half, 45%. Lukashenko also used the meeting to emphasize that airstrikes and modern weapons alone wouldn't be enough in the fight to come. A ground operation would always be needed, the Belarusian president said while talking in the purposefully vague context of modern war. But the message is clear: more modern weapons, more training on how to use them, more combat-ready soldiers. Lukashenko is saying it in a bunch of different ways, but every word out of his mouth over the last couple of days can be boiled down into a single statement. Belarus needs to be ready for a fight, and that fight is going to be with Ukraine. We started seeing the evidence that Belarus was preparing for something dark in the month prior to Lukashenko making all of his proclamations. On April 17th, the Kyiv Independent reported on comments made by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. According to Zelensky, Belarus has been building new roads and setting up artillery positions all along the border that it shares with Ukraine to the north, leading Zelensky to declare, "We believe that Russia will once again attempt to drag Belarus into its war." That may give us our answer as to what Lukashenko really meant when he said, "God willing, the war to come can be avoided." This isn't really about Ukraine, it's about Putin wanting more meat for the grinder. The sad part about all of this for Lukashenko is that he knows that modernization for the Belarusian army will only lead to it becoming even more of an asset for Putin. And when that happens, there are 3 scenarios that could present a clear danger to Ukraine, perhaps as much for the impact that they would have on the country's defense of its territory against Russia as for the direct threat that Belarus and its army pose. Before we dig into those scenarios, you may be wondering if it's really possible that Putin will push Lukashenko into participating in the war. The simple answer is, of course he would. He's done it before. Lukashenko is the closest ally that Putin has in Europe, especially now that Viktor Orban has been ousted from the seat of power in Hungary following 16 years of rule. The alliance between Russia is as one-sided as they come, and that was proven when Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Just a couple of weeks before the invasion began in earnest, the BBC was reporting on Russia staging joint military drills with Belarus. Those drills came at a time when Russia had amassed around 100,000 soldiers close to Ukraine's borders, even as Putin lied through his teeth and said that Russia had no plans to invade Ukraine. Soon after the 10 days of drills with Belarus concluded, Russia did what it said it wasn't going to do. Belarus played a massive role. Some of Russia's forces invaded Ukraine by crossing the border via Belarus, meaning that Lukashenko allowed his country to become a staging ground for Putin. Lukashenko himself admitted as much in August 2023, though he went to great pains to stress that not a single Belarusian was involved in the invasion. Well, not a single one except the one that gave the okay for Russia to use Belarus to invade Ukraine in the first place. It's also not like Lukashenko allowed this as a one-and-done favor to Putin. In December 2025, Al Jazeera reported that Zelensky had revealed that Russian forces were using ordinary apartment blocks in Belarus to launch attacks against Ukraine. Antenna and other equipment are located on the roofs of ordinary 5-story apartment building, which help guide Shahids to targets in our western regions, Ukraine's president declared. Belarus may be preparing for war right now. But the reality is that this is all an escalation of what Lukashenko has been allowing Putin to use Belarus to do since the moment Russia invaded Ukraine. What we're seeing here is a president who is trying to act like he's in control, hence all of the talk about preparing for a modern war, when he's really just diminished his own power to the point where he will end up forcing his country into a fight in which it should never have been involved. And all the while, Putin is happy to keep dragging the hapless Lukashenko down into the depths of his depraved war against Ukraine. To Russia's president, Belarus isn't a nation with its own people and sovereign ambitions. It's merely territory that Russia can use to open up a new front in the war. Slowly but surely, Putin is whittling away at Lukashenko's power, to the point where whatever Moscow wants, Moscow gets. The communications equipment installed on Belarusian roofs is evidence of that. Putin knows that Ukraine will want to get rid of that equipment, though doing so would involve a strike against Belarus. Russia's leader would love that. He could cast Ukraine as the villain for attacking an uninvolved country, and he could use such an attack to put pressure on Lukashenko to finally send the soldiers in. Ukraine is too smart to attack Belarus directly, even if it has become a puppet state in Putin's invasion. Still, Lukashenko has clearly had a fire lit up his backside. He isn't talking about being ready for war for no reason. Somebody has pulled his strings, and it's looking inevitable that Belarus is going to transform from a bit-part player into a major problem in the war. And if that happens, there are 3 possible scenarios that Ukraine has to be aware of, all of which create clear danger. But before we explore those scenarios, if this is the kind of insight that you want to see, make sure you are subscribed to The Military Show. We break it down like this every single week. So we have 3 scenarios, some of which feed into others, but all of which pose problems. First up, the scenario that Lukashenko seems to be implying will happen sooner or later, the full mobilization of the Belarusian military. The statements that something like this is coming are already being made, and the big question now is what happens next. In Ukraine's best-case situation, Belarus will mobilize and move its troops to its border with Ukraine, but not actively cross it. While that means no fighting in Ukrainian territory, the other 2 scenarios are much different. It's not like Ukraine could ignore something like this. It would still have to deploy troops and build up defenses across the border with Belarus, which are all resources that have to be taken away from the Eastern Theater, where Russia is making a push to take Donetsk and finally to claim the Donbass. That concept of diverting Ukraine's forces is going to be a recurring theme in these scenarios. Ukraine's worst-case situation when it comes to the Belarusian mobilization is that Lukashenko follows that up by sending his country's army into Ukraine. Belarus may only be a small country with a population of less than 10 million people, but it has mandatory military service for all adult males between the ages of 18 and 27, meaning it has built up a large pool of reserves to call upon if Lukashenko goes through with mobilization. According to Global Firepower, Belarus has 63,000 active personnel in its military, and 365,400 reserves that it can call upon if it mobilizes. That's an army of over 420,000, and there are 55,000 paramilitary troops on top of that Ukraine would have to worry about. Even if Belarus sends a quarter or a third of that force into Ukraine, that's a serious problem. Where that meat goes is the other issue that Ukraine has to deal with, and that leads us into the next scenario. Scenario 2 is that Belarus attempts an attack against the Ukrainian capital city of Kyiv. In this scenario, we'd see Belarus trying to repeat what Putin already failed to do during his initial 2022 invasion. That's no easy task, and it seems likely that a Belarusian invasion of Kyiv would result in heavy losses for Lukashenko's forces, as they come up against a far more battle-hardened Ukrainian military. Still, an attack on Kyiv, even by a military that relies more on numbers than nous, is a real issue. The recurring theme of diversion comes into play again. Ukraine's focus is on Donetsk and the southern territories, where it's been conducting a counterattack against Russia's forces. Ukraine also has forces stationed in northern regions such as Sumy and Kyiv, who are battling against Russian forces who want to create a buffer zone that stretches between those regions. None of this means that Ukraine doesn't have forces in Kyiv itself. But Belarus, being to the north of Ukraine, would have a path to Kyiv that it can follow without having to fight through the regions of Ukraine where the kill zones are shredding Russian forces. The path wouldn't be completely open. But the distance from Naralaya in Belarus to Kyiv in Ukraine is less than 170 kilometers as the crow flies, which isn't a huge amount of ground to cover. Ukraine is preparing for this possibility, as you'll soon discover, but it would still be forced to divert troops and reserves from elsewhere, which could create gaps in the defenses in priority regions that Russia would be able to exploit. Again, it's all about being the puppet for Putin. Lukashenko's poorly trained forces are unlikely to be impactful in terms of taking Kyiv on Russia's behalf, but they can certainly die in droves for Putin to Ukraine's defenses while Russia makes advances elsewhere. Belarus is a resource to Putin, nothing else. As for the third scenario, it's similar to the second, only with a slightly different goal. Belarus could send its soldiers streaming into Ukraine's western regions, perhaps as far as Lviv, which is near the Polish border. This type of raid could accomplish a few goals. First, it would be more stretched out than a direct push for Kyiv. So not only would Ukraine have to divert its forces, but it would have to deal with the front line expanding from the already massive 1,200 or so kilometers that it is right now into a line that could stretch close to 2,000 kilometers. Belarus would be able to pull Ukraine's forces all over the map, and Ukraine would simply have to respond because of the second goal this type of raid could accomplish, which is the sabotage of Ukrainian logistical routes in the rear. In this scenario, Belarus would likely favor infiltration tactics ahead of a full-blown invasion of Ukraine. Small units would be sent to attack railway lines and roads or to destroy bridges. The idea would be to delay the flow of soldiers and materials to the eastern front, as well as potentially disrupting the flow of Western weapons into Ukraine. In short, Lukashenko's soldiers will be focused on slowing Ukraine down in regions that Russia isn't able to target right now. The knock-on effects in places like Donetsk will be pronounced, not just because Ukraine would have to move soldiers from that region, but due to sabotage by Belarus making it more difficult to get the supplies that the soldiers who remain will need to defend their territory from Russia. Ukraine can't ignore the fact that Belarus seems to be preparing for a massive attack. But the one thing that Ukraine knows well is that Belarus isn't a strong military nation. The country has minimal warfighting experience in the 21st century. It attempted to get involved in the first Libyan civil war back in 2011, only to end up on the losing side. Beyond that, Belarus offered some limited support to the Ivory Coast during the first Ivorian civil war between 2002 and 2007, and it handed over its territory for Russia to invade Ukraine. Those aren't the sorts of combat credentials that will worry Ukraine too much when it comes to the capabilities of Lukashenko's troops, and when Ukraine's drones are destroying the vast majority of the 35,000 Russian soldiers who are becoming casualties of Putin's war each month, it's hard to believe that the Belarusian soldiers would fare any better. Putin won't care about the death, of course, he wants the diversion, and he appears to be pressuring Lukashenko to provide it. But the real question is, how would the Belarusian people react to their president going crazy enough to mobilize and send troops into Ukraine? Would that be one step too far, resulting in Lukashenko being deposed and Putin's plans crashing down? Mass protests engulfed Belarus in 2020 following Lukashenko's engineered re-election on August 9th. Perhaps Belarus's president is miscalculating when it comes to the reaction of his people to a war with Ukraine. We would have to wait and see what direction Belarus's people and military will take if Lukashenko gives the order. As for Ukraine, it's been preparing for something along these lines for a while now. The Hudson Institute notes that a visit by one of its authors to Kyiv revealed the existence of seemingly new fortifications that are pointing in the direction of the border with Belarus. Those may be the result of work that Ukraine had been putting in during the weeks and months before, as the country's State Border Guard Service spokesman Andriy Demchenko revealed back in February. This direction is reinforced by various components of our country's defense forces, and the state borderline itself is also being fortified, with fortifications along the border so that all Ukrainian soldiers, all components of the defense forces located in this direction, have every opportunity to counter any threat that may come from the territory of Belarus, Demchenko stated, and he revealed that fortifications are being prepared across the entire 1,000-kilometer border that Ukraine shares with Belarus. Global Security adds that Belarusian intelligence suggests that Ukraine maintains a contingent of 14,000 soldiers near the border, who have been in place for several years. The mines and other layered fortifications, the same outlet reports, have likely been joined by the same kinds of drones that Ukraine uses in its kill zones on the eastern front. All of this is wise on Ukraine's part. It also shows that Ukraine has been working to ensure that Russia can't pull the same trick that it pulled back in February 2022 without facing a lot of difficulty. Belarus may feel somewhat confident that a mobilized version of its army could make some progress through Ukraine's defenses, though how far it could get if Ukraine reinforces its defenses with reserves is a real question. But what Lukashenko may not realize is that it's not just Ukraine that he would have to worry about if he sends his country to war. Poland and Lithuania will be problems too. On May 6, TVP World reported that both nations had taken part in NATO-led drills in the Suwałki Gap, which is a thin strip of land that separates Belarus and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. That land is seen as one of the most sensitive areas of NATO's eastern defense against Russia, and its strategic importance has only grown since Putin invaded Ukraine. The exercise, which was dubbed Brave Griffin, focused specifically on the rapid deployment of troops and allied coordination in a potential defensive scenario where NATO needs to repel an attack via the Suwałki Gap. That's interesting. What Lukashenko now has to think about is whether an invasion of Ukraine could lead to its NATO neighbors growing concerned. Poland and Lithuania border Belarus to its west and northwest. If Lukashenko makes the push into Ukraine, that could be the trigger that these nations and perhaps other NATO members need to take Belarus out of the picture. After all, Belarus is Putin's puppet state. Lukashenko getting more aggressive amounts to Russia expanding the scope of the Ukraine war. That could be what finally leads to a NATO response, which would make Lukashenko's call to war the gravest miscalculation he has made as the dictator of Belarus. And adding to all of this is the one thing that we haven't reported about the likely Ukrainian response to a Belarusian invasion: long-range strikes. A glimpse into Belarus's future may come from the fire that Ukraine has been raining down on Russia's oil refineries and military infrastructure over the last few weeks. Check out our video to learn about the firestorm that Ukraine unleashed on Russia in mid-April, and then ponder whether that's something that Belarus could absorb if it invades Ukraine. And if you gain some new insight from this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show so you don't miss any of our analysis of the latest developments in the European security situation. And thank you, as always, for watching.